There are mornings in Oxford when the light hesitates before it dares to fall. That morning was one of them. The air hung between frost and thaw, the college stones breathing faintly like something alive. I had walked without purpose, as I often did, tracing the cobbled paths of St. Athanasius, half remembering a line from Virgil that refused to settle in my mind. There is a kind of comfort in incompleteness. I have always found it so. The porter had nodded to me from the gate, his cap slightly askew. I think now it was Arthur Pym, though I did not know his name then. I remember only the look of that combination of humility and guarded knowledge peculiar to men who have spent their lives opening doors for others. I raised a hand, and he returned the gesture with that mild indifference the old acquired toward the ceremonious habits of the educated. Beyond the quadrangle, the chapel bell began its uneven tolling, one note sharp, one curiously dull. The sound echoed against the library facade, a rhythm that faltered like a breath interrupted. I paused, listening, and thought of how imperfection often lingers longer in the ear than beauty. By the time I reached Randolph that evening, the bar was warm with academic conversation, small scandals, misplaced commas, departmental politics dressed in irony. I ordered a whiskey I didn't need and unfolded the Oxford Mail, more for habit than hunger. It was buried near the classifieds, a paragraph that might have gone unnoticed. College porter dies in fall from library staircase. Authorities described death as a tragic accident. The brevity irritated me. Death deserved at least a sentence of curiosity. Something in the phrasing possible misadventure clung like a burr. The word misadventure has always seemed dishonest to me. It pretends to forgive what it secretly condemns. I folded the paper and sat for a while, tracing a ring of condensation on the counter. Outside, the street lamps blurred in the mist. I thought of the porter's tired eyes, his slow nod. There was, even then, the faintest murmur of unfinished business. Later, walking back through the drizzle, I passed the north wall of St. Athanasius and noticed the faintest scrape of stone near the library arch. A mason's repair, perhaps, or perhaps something more recent. It meant nothing at the time, yet I remember running my fingers across the mark and feeling a small vibration in the air, like a sound too low to hear. In my room, I poured another measure and tried again to summon that elusive Virgilian line. Omnia mutantur, nos et mutamur in illis. Everything changes, and we change with it. Perhaps that was the one. I found myself thinking about the man who had fallen, whether he had climbed those narrow stairs for duty or for something less ordinary. There are places in Oxford that keep their own counsel, and the Fellows' Library is among them. Its windows, high and narrow, reveal nothing but shadow by day and reflection by night. I had visited once, years before, to consult a manuscript no one read anymore. I remembered the silence there, the kind that carries its own history. You feel it in your chest rather than hear it. The next morning, when Lewis telephoned about a routine coroner's inquiry, he called it and I agreed before he finished. He sounded almost apologetic, knowing my temper toward bureaucratic deaths. I told him there was no such thing. And so I found myself once more in that grey light, walking beneath the college arch where the porter had stood. The echo of the chapel bell drifted again, unsteady as before. I felt a strange certainty that the tone had shifted, deepened perhaps imperceptibly. These are the things that begin a case, not confessions, not fingerprints, but the smallest betrayal of harmony. A note slightly wrong, a word that does not belong, a silence that has learned to speak. It was Lewis who said, in his good-natured way, that the dead man had been unlucky. I remember watching the rain slide down the windscreen and thinking how that word, unlucky, always seems to absolve the living of effort. We drove in silence through St. Giles, the road slick and shining, until the college gates came into view black iron, flanked by ancient stone lions whose faces had softened with centuries of rain. St. Athanasius was not one of the grander colleges. Its name appeared in guidebooks mostly for its chapel ceiling and a modest connection to a minor Elizabethan poet. Yet there was a certain melancholy dignity in its neglect. The quadrangle smelled of wet leaves and chalk, the kind of scent that clings to the past as though unwilling to surrender. We were received by Dr. Fairfax, the senior tutor, a man whose handshake conveyed the exact temperature of civility. He led us through the cloister, offering apologies that seemed pre-written, each phrase weighed for academic correctness. I noticed that his shoes were polished to a dull perfection, as if even the leather were reluctant to reflect. He spoke of poor Arthur Pym in the manner one might describe a damaged piece of furniture, regrettable, but not worth sentimental repair. Lewis asked the expected questions: time, discovery, witnesses. Fairfax's answers were smooth, too smooth. When he said, "I believe the man had been drinking," I watched his mouth, the faint delay between word and breath. The lie did not lie in what he said, but in what he hurried past. Inside the Fellows' Library, the air was thick with polish and something faintly medicinal. The death had already been tidied away, as though grief were unseemly among the learned. I ran a hand along the long oak table. Dust had been disturbed unevenly, two parallel streaks cutting toward the window. They had not come from a fall, they were too deliberate, too narrow. Someone had dragged something or someone across the surface. Lewis busied himself with notes, and I moved toward the narrow staircase that curled upward like an afterthought. Each step murmured, underfoot. Near the top, the grain of the wood shifted a faint indentation, barely visible, but enough to tell me that one foot had pressed harder than the other. Pym's weight, perhaps, or another's haste. The tread was smaller than I expected, and newer. From below came the sound of murmured conversation Fairfax had with the college bursar, a cautious man named Lanyon, who seemed more distressed by the potential for bad publicity than by the fact of death. Their words drifted upward, indistinct but rhythmically false, as though the two men were reciting politeness from memory. In a corner near the stairhead hung a portrait of the founder, a bishop with watery eyes and a hand resting on a closed book. The painter had caught something more than piety, a hint of secrecy or shame. I stared longer than was necessary. Behind me, a draft stirred the pages of an open ledger. Someone had left it lying there on the borrowing register, its pages faintly crinkled from damp. The final entry, dated 2 nights before Pym's fall, recorded a name I could barely read, the ink smudged, the signature trembling. The book in question was Horace the Odes. When I pointed this out to Fairfax, his answer came too quickly. "Routine audit," he said. "Pym was assisting with the cataloguing." I nodded, but something within me, that quiet itch of misfit detail, began to wake. Pym could neither read nor write. I knew it instinctively, in the same way one knows the smell of dust is older than its color. As we left, I turned once more toward the staircase. The faint scent of polish lingered, overlaid by candle wax and damp wool. The corridor outside seemed longer than before. Fairfax walked ahead, his voice offering condolences to no one in particular. Behind him, the bursar adjusted his cufflinks twice within a single sentence. The gesture told me more than their words, the body confessing what the intellect refused. It was only when we reached the gate that Lewis broke the silence. "A fall," he said, "seems simple enough." I answered that nothing simple ever happens in a library. He laughed, thinking it a joke, but I wasn't sure it was one. The bell began again, that same faltering rhythm from the morning before, one note sharp, the other dull. Somewhere behind those walls, truth had learned to whisper in uneven tones. There are rooms in Oxford that seem to absorb the footsteps of those who enter. The Fellows' Library was one such room, still as a chapel, yet faintly aware of trespass. The morning after our first visit, Lewis returned with the library register, neatly wrapped in brown paper. He laid it on my desk as though it were evidence of a private sin. I remember the smell before anything else, the faint sweetness of old ink and leather binding, that peculiar perfume of decay that clings to books no one reads. Lewis, ever literal, said there was something odd about the handwriting in the final entry. I leaned forward, seeing at once what his eyes could not name: the hand that wrote Horace. The odes trembled, yes, but not with age, with imitation. Someone had tried too hard to appear uneducated, forcing the letters downward, adding an unnecessary flourish to the H. A man feigning ignorance always leaves behind a trace of vanity. I thought of Pym, the porter, who could barely spell his own name. He had been framed not only in death, but in script. Someone had used his supposed illiteracy as camouflage. When we went back to the college that afternoon, the air carried the smell of polish and rain again, as though the building refused to dry. The librarian, a thin woman named Miss Harcourt, waited for us in the vestibule. Her voice was careful, rehearsed, the tone of one who has long lived under the gaze of hierarchy. She told us the library had been closed the evening before the accident, and no fellows had signed in after dusk. Her phrasing interested me more than her content. No fellows had signed in. I asked whether visitors sometimes entered without record. Her eyes flickered, a pause between words too brief to measure, yet they were all the same. Lewis busied himself examining the steps where Pym had fallen. They'd been scrubbed since, perhaps to remove blood, perhaps conscience. I lingered at the far shelf, running my fingers along the spines of forgotten volumes. Horace, when I found it, stood slightly out of line, its leather darkened unevenly by recent handling. The gilt title had been worn to ghost letters. I pulled it free, and it opened naturally at a page near the center, where the crease was soft and the edges faintly smudged. The line underlined in pencil read, "Even now the fields are silent, but the footsteps echo on." Someone had drawn the faintest mark beside it, a vertical line, hesitant but deliberate. A reader who wished to be noticed, or one who couldn't resist leaving proof of recognition. Miss Harcourt watched me too closely when I replaced the book. I asked whether she knew who borrowed it last. She claimed ignorance of the register, after all, spoke for itself. Her hands, clasped before her, betrayed a slight tremor, not of fear perhaps, but of memory. She added, after a pause too long for comfort, that Dr. Fairfax had spent some time in the library that week, though she wasn't certain of the day. Outside, the bells struck 4, their sound caught in the wet air. I turned to Lewis and told him to note that the missing book had been returned. He frowned, puzzled. "But it's there," he said. I told him that was precisely the point. Books, like alibis, often appear only after they've been missed. On our way out, we passed the cleaning cupboard beside the stairwell. A faint scent of turpentine drifted from within, and on the floor, half hidden by a mop handle, lay a torn scrap of paper. I picked it up. A corner of lined foolscap, the rest burned away, leaving a few words written in the same exaggerated hand as the register. Only the phrase remained, "Dr. F. knows the rest lost to ash." That night, back in my room, I set the scrap beside the clipping from the Oxford Mail. I poured a small whiskey and tried to reconstruct the sentence. Know what? The mind prefers symmetry. It wants to finish the pattern, yet Oxford resists such closure. The dead man's silence, the book's false borrowing, the underlined line all pointed toward an unseen reader. Someone who had rewritten the past in careful, educated script and hoped no one would notice the tremor of guilt that bled through the ink. She was waiting for me in the small common room beyond the chapel, a narrow space lined with portraits whose eyes had not learned discretion. Miss Emma Calder, a research fellow in English, though her demeanor suggested a woman who read poetry to confirm rather than to discover. I remember thinking that she had the self-possession of someone accustomed to loneliness and the precision of thought that often accompanies it. She offered tea as though the gesture excused her reluctance. I declined. The light from the mullioned window fell across her face, and I noticed the faintest mark near her temple, an old scar, perhaps, or the remnant of an argument with the world. She began to speak of Arthur Pym, haltingly at first, as though testing my capacity for patience. He was kind, she said, though that word seemed insufficient. He used to bring her tea when she worked late in the Fellows' Library, and once she smiled then, briefly, once he had found her asleep among the books and had left a blanket over her shoulders without a word. Her eyes lowered when she spoke of his death. She believed he had seen something he shouldn't have, though she didn't specify what. I asked her what kind of things she imagined. She hesitated, then said that sometimes at night she heard footsteps in the upper gallery, too heavy to belong to her, too soft to belong to the cleaners. She had assumed it was one of the fellows, or the bursar, or perhaps the porter himself. But the night before he died, she had heard a different sound, not footsteps, but the scrape of something wooden across the floor, followed by the faint closing of a door that should have been locked. Lewis would have pressed her, but I simply listened. People will tell you what they fear if you leave silence long enough. She said Pym had mentioned once that certain men carried keys they no longer admitted to possessing. I asked whether she had seen anyone that night. She looked toward the window, where the rain had begun again, and said only that the chapel bell had rung once out of sequence and without ceremony. There was something deliberate in her vagueness. Not deceit exactly, but the self-protective uncertainty of someone who knows more than she has decided to remember. I asked her about Dr. Fairfax. She said he was courteous, but that courtesy can be a mask. He disliked interruption, she added, and disliked women who worked too late. I could have left it there, but a line from the inquest returned to me Fairfax's mention that Pym had been helping with an inventory. I asked whether she had seen the list. She shook her head. Then, almost absently, she drew a folded sheet from her notebook. It was a scrap of ruled paper, torn unevenly, the ink faded at the edges. She said she'd found it under the reading desk 2 mornings after the accident. It contained a single sentence. He knows about the letter. No signature, only the faint impression of a ring in one corner, a circle stained with wine. She seemed relieved once she had shown it, as though confession required an object. I took it carefully. The handwriting was the same uneven imitation I had seen in the register, but the word letter had been underlined twice, almost impatiently. I wondered whose ring had pressed that mark into the paper. Fairfax's broad signet, perhaps, or something more delicate. When we left the room, she asked whether I thought Pym had been killed. I said that accidents seldom carry footnotes. She smiled, a brittle smile, and replied that in Oxford, even deaths are annotated. As I walked back across the quad, the chapel bell tolled again, this time properly, though it felt no less discordant. I paused beneath the cloister and studied the note once more. The paper smelled faintly of varnish and lilac, the sort of scent that lingers on gloves. I slipped it into my pocket, wondering whose hands had left it behind, and whether guilt, like perfume, fades or only waits to be noticed. There are days when the mind insists on circling a single word, as though meaning might surrender under pressure. That morning, it was veritas. Truth. The word had appeared twice, once in the coroner's report, which claimed Pym's death to be the truth of the accident, and again on a scrap of paper I found folded inside an unposted envelope addressed to Dr. Fairfax. A crossword clue written in an uncertain hand. In vino veritas, but where lies the lie? Lewis thought it a joke. I didn't. The handwriting was educated but self-conscious, as if the writer had worn intelligence like a borrowed coat. I read the phrase several times, tracing the pause after vino, the hesitation in the ink before the word. Lie. Latin is rarely used without purpose in Oxford. It has become the language of both vanity and concealment. Fairfax received us in his rooms later that afternoon. The man had the bearing of someone accustomed to silence obeying him. Bookshelves surrounded him like sentries, rows of theology, philosophy, and the kind of moral treatises no one truly reads. He appeared untroubled by the investigation, even faintly amused. When I asked about the envelope, he regarded it with polite curiosity, claiming not to recognize the handwriting. His denial arrived too easily, as if prepared long before the question. Lewis asked whether Pym could have written it. Fairfax smiled in that dry academic way that passes for compassion. Unlikely, he said, unless the porter had acquired a classical education in his final hours. The remark lingered between us like a faintly unpleasant perfume. When we left, Lewis muttered that Fairfax seemed sure of himself. I told him certainty is a fragile performance. It cracks in silence. Back in my office, I laid out the evidence. The false library entry, the torn note about the letter, and now the envelope with its riddle. 3 fragments, each tethered by language. The mind, I found, can accept ignorance more easily than inconsistency, and there was something inconsistent in the Latin itself. In vino veritas, in wine, truth, but the clue reversed it, where lies the lie? Whoever wrote it understood that the proverb conceals its own paradox. The truth found in wine may be a truth regretted in sobriety. I remembered the wine stain on Miss Calder's note, the faint circular mark. A coincidence, perhaps, but the mind collects such things against its will. That evening I attended evensong at St. Athanasius. Not from faith, I have too little of that, but from habit. The air was heavy with wax and the memory of incense. Fairfax sat 2 pews ahead, his profile perfectly still. As the choir began the Magnificat, I noticed a small detail. He mouthed the Latin phrases, yet stumbled on the verse Deposuit potentes de sede. The rhythm faltered for a breath, then resumed. I found myself wondering how often a man who lives among words forgets their weight. After the service, I lingered near the vestry. Fairfax passed by, offering a brief nod. His fingers were stained faintly red, as though from ink or wine. Later, in my room, I unfolded the envelope once more under the lamplight. The faint impression of another message had pressed through from the sheet above it, a ghost of handwriting. I shaded over the surface with a pencil, gently, until the letters emerged. Keep the register, he suspects. The words might have been written by Fairfax, or for him. Either way, the intention was the same: containment. Pym had known something, and knowledge, in Oxford, is always dangerous when it moves down the hierarchy. I set down the pencil and poured myself a measure of whiskey, watching the amber catch the lamplight. In vino veritas, I murmured, though truth, like Latin, survives best when mistranslated. Somewhere in that phrase, I felt the shape of motive beginning to form. Not yet clear, but trembling at the edge of understanding, like a word recalled too late to save the sentence. It was Lewis who first mentioned the choir. He'd been chatting with one of the porters, as he always did, and learned that St. Athanasius still held its own evensong twice a week, though attendance had dwindled to a few lonely voices. The fellows preferred their theology silent, it seemed, yet something about the routine, the quiet persistence of it, appealed to me. Rituals outlive faith. They survive because they have rhythm, and Oxford is built on rhythm. That evening the sky had begun to darken in that particular shade of ink blue peculiar to April rain. Its eyes crossed the quadrangle just as the first notes of the organ bled into the air soft, uncertain, as though testing its own existence. Inside the chapel, a handful of students gathered in the choir stalls, their white surplices gleaming faintly in the half-light. Fairfax sat near the front, his hands clasped, his expression a performance of piety. To one side, I noticed Miss Calder, her hair loosely tied, a hymn book held too tightly for comfort. Lewis whispered that we were intruding, but I ignored him. Listening to the choir in Oxford is a kind of investigation where you learn more from hesitations than from harmonies. The rehearsal began with Nunc Dimittis. The boys sang the opening bars tentatively, their voices wavering in the vaulted space. Somewhere behind them, the choir master kept time with a pencil tapping against his knee. Fairfax's head inclined slightly to the rhythm, though now and then his gaze slid toward the north aisle where Miss Calder stood. When she turned a page, his fingers twitched the smallest betrayal of attention. Afterwards, Lewis drifted toward the vestry to ask practical questions. I remained in the nave, pretending to admire the stonework. It was there that I overheard it clearly, not even intentionally. Two fellows near the lectern, their voices softened by distance. One said he should have burned the letter. The other replied he didn't have the courage. I turned, but they had already moved behind the choir screen, their black gowns merging with shadow. Outside, the rain had begun again, tapping against the chapel windows with the persistence of regret. I stood beneath the awning, watching the water trace lines down the glass, and saw Fairfax emerge with Miss Calder. They walked side by side, not quite touching, but close enough for the illusion of intimacy. She said something I couldn't hear, and he laughed too easily, too loudly for the sanctity of the place. The sound jarred against the rain, then vanished. Later, as Lewis drove us back to the station, he spoke of Fairfax and the bursar, of their quarrel over the library renovations. He'd learned from a gardener that the two men hadn't spoken civilly for months. Money, he said. It always comes down to money. I half agreed, though in Oxford, money often masquerades as virtue. I stared through the windscreen, watching the wipers carve silence across the rain. When we returned to my flat, I found a parcel waiting on the doorstep with no note, only my name typed neatly on the label. Inside was an old photograph, creased at the corners, a group of fellows standing before scaffolding, and a banner reading Restoration of the Fellows' Library, 1972. Among the solemn faces, I recognized a younger Fairfax, the bursar beside him, and behind them, almost forgotten, Arthur Pym, standing at the edge of the frame. His expression even then was wary, as though he had already seen too much. I placed the photograph under the lamplight. In the background, faint but visible, the chapel roof appeared under repair, and near the base of the image, a blurred inscription half hidden by a fold in the paper. I adjusted the angle, and the words came into focus, for the record. The phrase felt deliberate, as though addressed to me across time. I thought of the whispered remark that he should have burned the letter, and of Fairfax's laughter that hadn't reached his eyes. Oxford, I reflected, has always preserved its sins with the same care it devotes to its manuscripts. I poured a small whiskey, the liquid catching the lamplight like an answer withheld. The choir's echo still lingered in my ears, fractured, uncertain, yet hauntingly sincere. Somewhere in that uneven harmony, I felt the faintest suggestion of pattern. Not revelation, not yet. Just the slow recognition that beneath the music, someone had been listening for the wrong note all along. Lewis brought the report mid-morning, his expression carrying that slight satisfaction policemen reserve for facts that appear to fit. The footprint near the staircase, he said, didn't match Pym's boots. He laid the photograph on my desk as though it might confess on its own. A neat, narrow impression, the sole patterned with small crosses, the kind worn by men who take their polish seriously. I said nothing at first. The absence of fit is often more revealing than its opposite. When Lewis asked if it meant anything, I told him not yet, though in truth it already had begun to whisper. We returned to St. Athanasius, beneath a sky so colorless it seemed to have mislaid its purpose. The quad glistened with recent rain. In such weather, Oxford feels neither alive nor dead merely paused. Fairfax met us at the entrance to the Fellows' Library, his courtesy precise, his discomfort rehearsed. He claimed to have been there the night of Pym's death, but only briefly, only to fetch a manuscript. He'd heard the fall, rushed to the stairs, found the poor man crumpled below. He repeated this with the weary patience of a man accustomed to authority, one who expects his version of events to become official by endurance alone. While he spoke, I studied his hands. The right bore a faint, narrow scratch, pale against the skin, too straight to be accidental. I asked about it, and he smiled. "A paper cut," he said, "from a folio of the college archives." He even offered to show me the document, but I declined. Truth never reveals itself when summoned. As we left the library, Lewis paused at the landing. He was staring at the window ledge. Someone had placed a small brass key there, tarnished but recently handled. Not Pym's. He said the porter's keys had been collected and logged. I turned it over in my hand. The shape was peculiar, long-shanked, with a loop worn to an oval. Not for the outer doors, then, but perhaps for something more private. Fairfax's expression, when I mentioned it, tightened almost imperceptibly. He said it belonged to an old cabinet, long unused. I slipped it into an envelope and told Lewis to have it tested, though I knew no laboratory could detect anxiety. We walked the quadrangle again. The rain had begun to fall softly, darkening the flagstones. Near the archway, I stopped. The ground was uneven, patched with new gravel. A small depression held a puddle that mirrored the tower above us, a reflection fractured by each drop of rain. It was there, looking down at that imperfect mirror, that the thought arrived that the footprint was not false because it didn't belong to Pym, it was false because it was meant to be found. Someone had stepped there after the fall, not before. Back at the station, Lewis went through the alibis with quiet diligence. The bursar, Lanyon, had been at a dinner in town. Fairfax had none save solitude and Latin. Miss Calder at her rooms, working late. Yet she too had keys given, she said, for convenience. When I asked her whether she still used them, she said only when it rained, her eyes steady, the lie so graceful it barely disturbed the air. That evening, I took the photograph of the footprint and placed it beside the old college photograph. Both bore the same signature precision, the sole's pattern, the stance of the men, the vanity of tidiness. Fairfax had that kind of vanity, so did Lanyon. So perhaps did I. I poured a drink and let the whiskey rest on the tongue. A line from Horace returned unbidden mutato nomine de te fabula narratur. Change the name, and the story is yours. I stared at the photograph again and thought of the faint scratch on Fairfax's wrist, the kind a sharp edge of brass might leave. The key, the cut, the footprint, 3 gestures of possession, carefully placed, perhaps too carefully. Outside, the bells began to toll, their rhythm uneven as ever, one note sharp, one dull. Oxford, with all its polish and scholarship, still couldn't keep time. By the next morning, the case had acquired that faint smell of false coherence that often precedes collapse. Every piece seemed to fit, and that, I have learned, is when one should start again. Lewis arrived with a file under his arm and a look of confidence that almost made me envious. He'd found something in the bursar's office, a copy of the late Dr. Lanyon's complaint against Fairfax, neatly typed and dated 2 months before Pym's fall. The accusation was simple enough alteration of a will connected to the library endowment. Motive, opportunity, proximity, the tidy trinity of police work. I told him that tidy things seldom stay true. Still, I read the file. It was too convincing. The tone of the letter was almost theatrical, as though written with the intention of being discovered. Even the Latin motto at the bottom, Fiat Justitia Ruat Caelum, felt like decoration, not belief. That afternoon we visited Miss Calder again. She looked thinner somehow, or perhaps the light from the window had grown less forgiving. I mentioned the bursar's letter, expecting curiosity, but she only shook her head. The two men had argued for years. She said the college thrives on grudges. She hesitated, then reached into a drawer and produced a folded paper. It was a poem, copied in a neat but anonymous hand. Pym had given it to her, she explained, weeks before his death. He told her it reminded him of someone who'd lost courage too late. The verses were from a forgotten Latin elegy, something about loyalty and remorse. But it wasn't the words that held me. It was the handwriting, too steady to be Pym's, yet deliberately tremulous. I ran my finger along the ink. A deliberate disguise, I thought, the same clumsy attempt I'd seen in the library register. Lewis, impatient, asked what it meant. I told him I didn't know yet. It was true, though not the whole truth. Beneath the poem, someone had signed it with initials A.F. Fairfax, perhaps, or someone who wanted me to think so. When we left, the sky had clouded again, the color of unwashed linen. The air smelled faintly of river water, and from the chapel drifted the sound of another rehearsal, a fragment of plain chant, fragile and imperfect. I remember thinking that Oxford's music always sounds half-forgotten, like the city itself. Back at the station, Lewis traced the bursar's movements. Lanyon had dined alone that night and returned to his rooms around 9. 2 witnesses confirmed it. Fairfax, meanwhile, had no one to account for him, though he insisted he'd been reading proofs until dawn. I stared at the photographs on my desk, the staircase, the footprint, the key, and now the poem. Each offered meaning, but none consented to connect. It was near midnight when the breakthrough came, though calling it that feels dishonest. I'd been staring at the Latin lines again, translating them under my breath, when a phrase emerged that refused to align. The word fidelis had been copied as fidelus. An educated man might make the slip deliberately, but never by accident. I reached for Horace's Odes, the same edition found in the library, and turned to the margin where someone had drawn a faint pencil line beside the verse about footsteps echoing. The same pale graphite, the same indentation. Whoever had copied the poem had also read this. The verses were not a confession, but a camouflage, a red herring in verse. Lewis, half asleep, asked what I'd found. I said only that we'd been following the wrong text. The truth, like translation, depends on context. Change one word, and the meaning shifts beneath your feet. Before leaving for the night, I glanced once more at the bursar's letter. Its motto started back, "Let justice be done, though the heavens fall." I wondered whether anyone in that college still believed in justice, or whether they merely liked the sound of Latin absolving them of guilt. In Oxford, the difference is often small enough to vanish between syllables. I slept poorly that night, the kind of restless half-sleep that belongs to unfinished thoughts. The rain had not stopped, and its rhythm against the window seemed to echo that Latin phrase still circling in my mind. Fidelus, a word that didn't exist, at least not in any proper sense. Someone had meant it to look learned, and in doing so had betrayed themselves. The false scholar always leaves a trace. Morning came thin and reluctant. Lewis was already waiting, coffee in one hand, impatience in the other. He'd spent the night pursuing the bursar's old files and found nothing except dust and forgotten signatures. But it wasn't the bursar I was thinking of. It was the initials on that poem A.F. They had been my compass for days, and I was beginning to suspect they pointed the wrong way. We walked to the college. The quad was deserted, its grass sodden and bruised. The chapel bell struck 9, though the sound felt hesitant, as though the bell itself were unsure of its purpose. In the porter's lodge, the same smell of furniture polish clung to the air. I asked the deputy porter for access to the archive room. He led us through a corridor that smelled of damp vellum and resignation. The records of St. Athanasius go back centuries, each generation carefully preserving its own vanities. On the second shelf from the bottom, bound in faded blue, I found a register of fellows from the early 1970s, the year of the photograph. And there, between Fairfax and Lanyon, was another name, Anna Fairfax. I sat down on the cold stone floor, tracing the name with a fingertip. She had been listed as a research associate, briefly, and then erased with a note in the margin, and resigned, 1973. No one resigns quietly from Oxford. Lewis looked puzzled, but the pattern had already begun to form. The initials AF in the poem are not Arthur Fairfax, but Anna, a woman whose existence had been tidied out of the record, as if her presence had been an administrative embarrassment. I remembered the photograph again, the faint female figure blurred at the edge, standing beside Pym. I'd taken her for a servant. Lewis muttered something about coincidence. I told him that coincidence was merely a clue too shy to speak. Later, I went to the library alone. The air was cold and the smell of wax lingered, faintly sweet and decaying. I found myself in front of the same shelf that held Horace's odes. Someone had moved it, and the dust told me so. A faint mark of clean wood traced the shape of its absence. I followed the gap to a higher shelf, and there it was again, returned to a slightly different position. A hand accustomed to concealment had placed it back without thinking to match the dust. Inside, the same underlined line stared back at me. Even now the fields are silent, but the footsteps echo on. Below it, faintly visible now in the lamplight, a second pencil mark crossed the page, a thin diagonal slash, almost like an A. The echo of an initial. I leaned against the desk, listening to the faint drip from a leaking gutter outside. Fairfax had inherited not just his wife's name, but her ghost. Pym must have stumbled on it, perhaps letters, perhaps photographs, something left in the archives from that earlier scandal. The will, the endowment, the affair, all fragments of an old story that someone had tried to erase. When I left the library, the rain had stopped. The flagstones glistened and the air carried the faint sweetness of magnolia from the college garden. For the first time in days, the silence felt heavier than the noise it replaced. I told Lewis nothing of what I'd found. Some truths are best left unspoken until they have settled into their final shape. Instead, I asked him to retrieve the college personnel records for 1972 and, as we crossed the quad, I caught sight of Dr. Fairfax standing at his window. His face, half obscured by reflection, looked older, smaller. He raised a hand as though in greeting, but the gesture felt like surrender. Back in my room that night, I poured a whiskey and opened the old poem once more. The ink had begun to fade. Fidelus, the false word, the false scholar, the false marriage. The same mistake repeated itself through the years. Outside, somewhere beyond the quiet hum of the city, the bells began again uncertain, uneven, the wrong notes lingering too long. Oxford, I thought, has always preferred its errors in Latin. There are nights in Oxford when silence takes on the texture of memory. That evening it came thickly, the kind that seems to muffle not just sound, but consequence. Lewis and I walked the cloister at St. Athanasius once more, our footsteps overlapping with those of the past, the stone echoing faintly under the weight of what we had not yet said. The master had insisted on one final interview. A formality, he called it, though his tone carried the strain of fatigue and something darker. We found Fairfax in the Fellows' Library, the fire long extinguished, the air smelling of cold ash and old polish. He was sitting at the long table where Pym had once kept his ledger, his hands resting upon it as if awaiting absolution. He began to speak before I could ask a question. His voice was thin, worn, as though hollowed out by the very Latin he'd spent a lifetime reciting. He told us he'd gone to the library that night, as he'd said before, But this time the details came differently, hesitant yet precise. He'd been looking not for a manuscript, but for a letter, one he'd been warned still existed. Pym had found it weeks earlier, tucked behind a loose binding. A letter written by Anna Fairfax, long before her name had been erased from the register. He said she'd written it to him as a plea, a confession, perhaps a farewell. But the words had been cruelly preserved, their meaning distorted by time. He wanted it destroyed. When Pym refused, when he said the letter belonged to the college, they'd struggled. A single push, a misstep, a fall, the kind of accident that men invent when guilt is too sharp to carry. Lewis shifted beside me, restless. I said nothing. Ears looked instead at Fairfax's wrist, the faint line of a healed cut, the same I'd noticed before. He followed my gaze and smiled without humor. I had forgotten that truth marks the body as surely as it stains the mind, he said. I asked him about the poem, the false initials, the forged hand. He seemed almost grateful for the question. That was his doing, he admitted, a way of diverting suspicion. He had written the poem himself, trying to frame it as Pym's final note, a man tormented by guilt over imagined sins. But, as always, the lie had betrayed him in grammar. He'd never been able to resist Latin, even in disguise. He stood then, his chair scraping softly against the stone. He said he would resign, of course, and that he would write to the master in the morning. His eyes moved to the window, where rain had begun again, tracing uncertain paths down the glass. I think he expected me to offer sympathy or perhaps judgment. Instead, I told him only that the letter had already done its work. Truth, I said, seldom waits for permission. When he turned away, the firelight caught his face, not the expression of a murderer, but of a man suddenly aware that remorse and relief can occupy the same silence. We left him there, the sound of our departure fading into the corridor's echo. At the doorway, I paused. There it was again, the soft creak of a board above us, deliberate, unmistakable. Lewis heard it too. He muttered that someone else must be in the building, but I knew the sound. It came not from presence, but from memory, the echo of Pym's nightly patrol, the footsteps that had haunted Miss Calder, and perhaps Fairfax himself. Outside, the rain fell harder. I told Lewis to leave the report unfinished until morning. He didn't argue. Oxford by then was a blur of light and water, its colleges breathing through the mist like tired old men. Later, in my room, I opened Horace's Odes one last time. The underlined lines stared up at me, pale as a prophecy. Even now the fields are silent, but the footsteps echo on. I read it aloud, softly, as if to test its endurance. The sound lingered long after I closed the book. It ended not with revelation, but with silence, the kind that follows when everything has been said, and yet nothing feels concluded. St. Athanasius resumed its polite routines. The flag was lowered, the porters returned to their ledgers, and the library reopened as if nothing had ever disturbed its dust. Oxford has a way of absorbing scandal, polishing it into footnote and legend. Fairfax resigned quietly. No trial, no headlines, no closure. He left behind an empty study, a few annotated manuscripts, and a reputation carefully embalmed by discretion. Lewis called it mercy, I called it inevitability. Some sins are too old for punishment, too fragile for the weight of justice. One evening, some weeks later, I returned to the college on impulse. The air had the faint scent of lilac and rain, that melancholy perfume peculiar to May. The porter nodded as I passed a younger man now, polite, incurious. Inside, the corridors felt smaller than I remembered, the walls nearer, as though the building had exhaled. In the Fellows' Library, the lamps burned low. No one was there, save the dust and the faint hum of age. I stood by the window where Pym had fallen and tried to imagine his last moments, the confusion, the sudden silence. I could almost hear his tread on the stairs, slow and dutiful, the sound that had troubled Miss Calder's sleep. But the only movement now was the flicker of flame in the hearth, restless and unsure. On the desk lay Horace's Odes, the same copy that had drifted through the case like a guilty conscience. Someone had placed it open at that familiar page. Even now the fields are silent, but the footsteps echo on. I traced the words with a fingertip, feeling the faint groove where the pencil had once underlined them. Whoever had done it had pressed too hard, as though to ensure the line endured beyond understanding. I thought of Anna Fairfax, a name erased but never gone. Perhaps she had written that letter out of remorse, or love, or the need to be remembered. The motives blur with time, as do the faces. What remains are gestures, a smudge of ink, a misplaced key, a false initial that refuses to fade. Lewis would later tell me he saw Fairfax in London, seated alone at a cafe near Bloomsbury, reading the Times as though still searching for a reason to belong. I never saw him again. I doubt he forgave himself, though I imagine forgiveness was not what he sought. As I sat there in the half-light, I realized that what haunted me most was not the fall, nor the lie, nor even the death itself. It was the quiet persistence of things left unsaid, the echoes that refused to rest, the sound of a footstep where none should be, the faint turning of a page long after the reader has gone. I poured a measure from my flask, a poor substitute for comfort, and raised it slightly toward the room, a private ritual for the unremembered. The whiskey burned like clarity, brief and cruel. Outside, the bells began to toll once more, that same uneven rhythm that had marked the case from its beginning, one note sharp, one dull, the pattern incomplete. I listened until the last vibration faded into the air, leaving behind that peculiar stillness that belongs only to Oxford at dusk. Before leaving, I closed the book and returned it to its shelf. The sound of it, soft, deliberate, final, felt heavier than I expected. On my way out, I caught my reflection in the darkened glass of a man surrounded by the ghosts of his own persistence. I thought of how every investigation ends not with certainty, but with the faintest acknowledgement of absence, the understanding that truth, like music, is heard best in the spaces between its notes. The door closed behind me. The echo of its latch merged with the soft rustle of the pages I'd just turned. And for a long moment it seemed that the library was still reading itself.